In this tutorial we're going to be looking at creating a simple visitor counter. The visitor counter is going to be non-unique, and by non-unique I mean that for every page refresh we're going to increment an integer, and this integer is essentially going to equate to how many times the page has been visited. So it's not going to be unique, it's not going to be based on the users as a whole that have visited the website, but more like page refreshes. So if one person visits 5 times, the total amount of hit is going to be 5. As with most hit counters, they are unique, but this just gives you an idea of functions. We're going to be using a global variable inside of our function, and we're also going to be dealing with our file get contents function and our file put contents function. So the first thing we need to do is establish where we want to store our results. So we need to store this in a text file. The first thing I'm going to do is create a variable called file name, and this is going to be equal to counter.txt. So obviously we're using a .txt extension, which is a text file. The next thing we need to do is outline our main function. And now if you were creating this and wanted to use this function on every page, you can include this with the include function in PHP on every page you wanted to count. And then you could just call the function within your page, assuming you wanted to count hits on that page. So if you don't completely understand, watch the tutorial and you'll see how it all works. So the first thing we need to do is define a function, and this function is going to be called inc count. So inc standing for increment. Okay, so we've got inc count. What we don't need to do is specify any parameters in here. We don't need to pass any information to this function, because all it's doing is incrementing the value inside counter.txt by 1 every time. Okay, so we're going to call this function down here a bit later on. As it stands, this will not work without you calling the function, so bear that in mind when you're making this. Okay, so the next thing we need to do is make this file name global so we can use it inside of our function. You've noticed that we've defined the variable outside of the function, we need to be able to use it within. So we use the global keyword, and then we just specify the variable name, which is file name. So this here corresponds to this here. Okay, so the first thing we need to do is check whether this counter.txt actually exists, and we use a function called file_exists. So very useful in a variety of different applications. So let's create our if statement. We're using if and then 2 rounded brackets for the condition, and then we use curly brackets opening and closing for the block, and inside here is what we're going to do if the file does exist. We also need an else on here, so we're creating an if-else statement in total, else and then another block. So the first thing we want to do inside of here is say if file_exists, and then in brackets is going to be the file name itself, and obviously we've already defined this and made it global, so we can just put file name in there. So what this function is going to do is check if counter.txt exists in the current directory. You can obviously add things like folder /file name, and you can use a full stop to append that, so it would be folder /file name, but we're just using it inside the current directory that we're working in. And later on you'll see that when we run the function or call the function, we're going to have counter.txt appear in here as well. So if file exists file name, what do we do? Well, assuming that the file does exist, it would mean that we do have some kind of value in it already. Because later on in the else statement, the else block, we're actually going to define the current value as 0 and then input that in. So if it doesn't exist, we're going to put a value of 0 into it. So what we want to do is we want to say current_value. I'm just creating a variable called current_value, and this is going to be equal to file_get_contents, and in brackets, obviously this is pretty self-explanatory, it's going to be the contents of our file counter.txt. So the current value is going to equal something as long as the file exists. Otherwise we need to set a default value for this current value, and that's going to be 0. So let's just think about this logically. If the file doesn't exist, we're going to set a value of 0 to current value, and then underneath here we're going to actually write either of these values, depending on which block was run, to a text file. So we use the file put contents function, and that's going to write this current value to the file. Now let's say that we run and the file doesn't exist. Current value is equal to 0. Now we're writing to file name, and then we use a comma, so we're using two parameters, file name and then the value that we actually want to write, or the value we want to write to this file. So the value that we want to write to this file is going to be current value plus plus. So plus plus is an operator which increments the current value. So let's go through this. If the file does exist, we get the current value of the contents. That could be 5, 10, 1,000. Down here, this is going to add 1 to this value here. So if we have 1,000 visitors already, this is going to equal 1,001 and input it back into counter.txt. Otherwise, the counter value, or the current value, is going to equal 0, and therefore, assuming that the first time we view this page, we're going to increment, and therefore this will then equal 1. Okay, so we set this to 0 so we can then increment it to 1 for the first time the page is viewed.